What if everything you have experienced up to this day wasn't real? What if, instead of memories, experiences, and decisions, everything was part of something bigger, something designed, controlled, or even programmed from the outside? Perhaps the most unsettling part is not the answer to these questions, but the fact that it is impossible for any of them to be a definitive answer. That is why, throughout history, theories and conspiracies have emerged that seek to question what we see, what we hear, and in general, everything we take for granted. And yes, some may sound absurd, others exaggerated, but they all have one thing in common. If they were true, they would change the way we understand our very existence, and that is quite chilling. So, get comfortable and turn off the lights, because these are 7 absolutely terrifying theories and conspiracies. Before we begin, we want to announce that we have an event this coming May 5th in Mexico City. All the information is in the description, where you can buy your tickets, and we will give you more info later in the video. How are you doing? Good morning, afternoon, or evening. I greet you, your friend Nightcrawler, and your friend Masked Man. Welcome to Mundo Creepy. Let's begin. 1. Reality is a lie. Have you ever wondered if everything you see and touch actually exists? This doubt is not new and has haunted humanity for centuries. More than 2,000 years ago, a Chinese philosopher named Zhuangzi dreamed he was a butterfly flying happily. Upon waking, a sense of strangeness invaded him, and one question wouldn't let him be at peace. He didn't know if he was a man who had dreamed of being a butterfly, or if he was a butterfly now dreaming that he was a man. Later, the philosopher René Descartes realized that there were no clear signs to distinguish when we are awake from when we are dreaming, which opened up the possibility that our perception might not be reliable. A more modern version of this doubt is the brain in a vat theory. What if you didn't have a body? What if, at this moment, you were just a brain floating in a jar with special liquids to keep you alive, connected to a super advanced computer that sends electrical signals so perfect they make you believe you have feet and hands, and that you are existing in a real world, listening to my voice right now? But I don't exist. Only you exist, floating in that lonely jar. If this machine could simulate every sensation exactly, you would have no way of knowing if what you call reality is just a computer program, something like what movies like The Matrix propose. This idea is extremely interesting and goes hand in hand with another popular theory that questions our reality, the simulation hypothesis. Philosopher Nick Bostrom suggests that if technology continues to advance, future civilizations will have computers so powerful that they could create thousands of virtual worlds with people capable of thinking and feeling just like us. According to this reasoning, there would be so many millions of simulated worlds that the probability of us living in the original real world would be almost zero. It is most likely that we are part of a game or an experiment. A couple of years ago, this still sounded like science fiction, but with the gigantic progress artificial intelligence has made lately, this possibility has become much more tangible. Some scientists even suggest there could be clues to this in the laws of physics. There is a theory called the second law of infodynamics, which suggests that the universe tries to save energy and space by compressing information, exactly like a computer does when processing data. If the universe behaves like software seeking to optimize its resources, this reinforces the belief that our world could be digital. 2. The Holographic Principle. Another equally fascinating theory suggests that our reality may be nothing more than a projection, something like a 3D movie that we see projected on a flat screen. This is a bit difficult to process, but I'll explain. This idea is called the Holographic Principle, and it was born from studying black holes. Scientists Leonard Susskind and Gerard Tufte suggested that all the information of an object that falls into a black hole does not disappear, but stays stored on its surface. This led to the idea that the entire universe could function the same way. Everything we see, feel, and experience would be a projection of data stored on a flat, distant boundary of the cosmos. If this is true, we and the stars would be like holograms created by information stored at the edge of the universe. Under that vision, the fundamental building block of existence would not be matter or energy, but information, as if reality were a computer code generating everything we know. This theory, although it sounds quite crazy, is one of the most respected by the greatest minds in physics, because it could help unite the laws that govern atoms with the laws that govern planets, something science has tried to do for decades without success. 3. Last Thursdayism. But there is an even stranger and more fascinating theory. It is called Last Thursdayism, or the Last Thursday Theory. This theory starts from the following idea. Imagine that the universe was created just a few days ago, specifically last Thursday. Suddenly, we appeared with all our memories already installed, believing that we have existed for millennia as humanity and that we have had long lives, surrounded by loved ones with whom we have shared memorable moments, when in reality those memories are false and we have only been existing for a few days. The most unsettling thing about this proposal is that it is impossible to disprove. According to philosopher Bertrand Russell, there is no logical proof to demonstrate that the world did not begin just 5 minutes ago. Whether we live in a computer simulation, are the projection of a cosmic hologram, or are a brain in a jar, I think we have no choice but to continue with our lives, enjoying this reality, even if it was created just 5 minutes ago. 4. The dead internet theory. Have you ever stopped to think how many of the users you interact with on the internet are actually people? If your answer is yes, don't worry. You are not alone. For several years, many users have begun to notice that there is a strange sensation when navigating different social networks, as if something doesn't quite fit. Comments from accounts that seem to repeat the same phrases or ideas, responses that lack sense, or users who interact endlessly but don't seem to have a clear identity behind their actions. That sensation gave rise to what is now known as the dead internet theory. This idea began circulating since the late 2010s in forums like 4chan, although it wasn't until 2021 that it took a more defined shape after a long text titled Dead Internet Theory. Most of the internet is fake, was published on the forum Agorism. It proposed something very direct, that the majority of the web is no longer composed of humans, but of bot activity and content generated automatically. According to this theory, at some point near the year 2016, the internet stopped being a space dominated by people and began to transform into something else, an environment controlled by algorithms, where much of what we see is no longer the product of real human interaction. But the idea isn't limited just to the existence of these bots, as they have been well known for years. What it proposes is that these systems began to progressively replace real users to the point where posts, comments, trends, and even entire accounts could be generated by AI or automated programs. This would imply that millions of interactions on the internet no longer occur between people, but between systems. A phenomenon that garnered significant attention in recent years was Shrimp Jesus, a series of images generated by AI showing various religious figures combined with crustaceans. While at first glance it might seem like a trend originating from the internet's characteristic absurd dark humor, what caught attention was the type of interaction it generated, accumulating tens of thousands of reactions on social networks, with posts full of empty profiles that comment repetitively and provide extremely generic responses. This theory points out that all of this is part of a cycle where automated systems generate content, which in turn is driven by other automated accounts, creating a kind of ecosystem where activity is maintained by itself without the need for constant human participation. And it is from here that the theory starts to become darker and more unsettling. Some versions maintain that this phenomenon simply responds to the economic interests of certain companies, which seek to generate interactions to obtain advertising revenue, inflate metrics, and position their content. But others propose something broader and more sinister, the possibility that these systems are being used to influence people's perception, amplify or diminish certain ideas, or even create the sensation that there is a consensus on specific topics. And although this may sound exaggerated, there are data that have fueled this perception. For example, in 2016, the cybersecurity firm Imperva performed an analysis of more than 16 billion web visits, concluding that approximately 52% of internet traffic came from automated programs. Years later, in a 2023 report, this figure remained near 49.6%. That is to say, a significant portion of internet activity does not come directly from people. Furthermore, studies like one conducted in 2018, which analyzed more than 14 million social media posts, found that bots play a major role in spreading information from unreliable sources, thus amplifying their reach and making them appear more popular than they actually were. However, it is important to clarify one thing at this point. There is no complete evidence to support the most extreme version of the theory, because as far as we know, the majority of internet interactions are still human. The content that really stands out, the opinions that generate conversation, and the comments that go viral, are in large part still provoked by real people, like you, for example, who are listening to this content. Even so, that doesn't change the fact that the internet is no longer what it once was. It's no longer an open space with independent sites and small communities. Today, it is concentrated in a few platforms that depend on algorithms to decide which content is shown and which is not, algorithms that prioritize what generates interaction regardless of the origin, thus allowing automated content to have more and more space. Furthermore, to all this is added another factor. The amount of content generated by AI has begun to grow at an accelerated rate, filling platforms with images, texts, and responses that often add nothing, but continue to circulate and accumulate interactions. That is why, although this theory doesn't speak of the extinction of humanity, absolute control of the masses, or universal deception, it remains quite unsettling because the idea that a large portion of the comments and posts you encounter might not come from real people is something that feels quite bleak. 5. The HAARP Conspiracy. Deep in Alaska, in a place called Gakona, lies a scientific facility that has generated all kinds of questions and theories since its founding. It is the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, better known as HAARP. Officially, this is a scientific research center now operated by the University of Alaska Fairbanks and is dedicated to studying the ionosphere, which is the highest and most sensitive layer of our atmosphere. However, for a large group of people, this block of antennas hides a much darker purpose. The history of these facilities began in the 1990s as a military defense project funded by the United States Air Force and Navy. This initial connection with the military, added to the construction cost of about $250 million and the secrecy surrounding its operations, quickly fueled public doubt. Although scientists have explained several times that the project's main objective is to understand how the ionosphere affects radio waves to improve communications and navigation systems like GPS, conspiracy theory proponents suggest that HAARP is actually a doomsday machine with terrifying capabilities. One of the most popular theories claims that HAARP has the ability to manipulate the climate globally. It is said that by firing powerful beams of concentrated energy toward the sky to heat the ionosphere, the military could create hurricanes, trigger devastating floods, or generate extreme droughts to weaken other countries. Some researchers, like Dr. Nick Begich, even claim that this technology could turn the upper atmosphere into a kind of giant lens, causing strange and dangerous visual effects in the sky. In 1999, the European Parliament passed a resolution expressing its concern over the environmental impact of the HAARP project and asked for an independent body to evaluate its ethical and legal risks. Although the project leaders insisted that the antennas do not have enough power to affect the climate, the mystery deepened when U.S. Air Force documents appeared that mentioned the military's desire to own the weather by 2025. For many occult enthusiasts, the definitive evidence is found in the patents of one of the scientists who helped create the project, Dr. Bernard Eastland. His documents describe a method to alter regions of the Earth's atmosphere that contradicts the official version that the site only serves scientific research. According to these patents, HAARP's technology could not only disrupt communications in large areas of the planet but also deflect missiles or change wind patterns in the upper atmosphere. Beyond climate control, there is an even more unsettling theory that suggests HAARP could be used to manipulate human minds. Some researchers claim that through the use of advanced computers, emotional signature clusters have been identified, that is, digital patterns of brain waves that function as a secret code for specific feelings, supposedly allowing them to identify an emotion like anger, fear, or sadness, record it, and then transmit it to other people so they experience it unconsciously. To support this idea, conspiracy proponents point to real patents like number 5,159,703, which describe subliminal communication systems that the ear cannot hear but the subconscious can process. According to this view, messages could be inserted into television and radio waves, or even launched from satellites to influence entire populations without anyone realizing it. The reach of these suspicions has led to blaming the project for almost any major natural disaster that has occurred in recent decades. For those who doubt the official versions, the fact that secret tests to create tsunami bombs were carried out during World War II proves that the military has sought to turn nature into a weapon for a long time. Despite these stories, the scientific community maintains a very different and much calmer version. They point out that the climate is formed in the troposphere, the lowest layer of the sky, while the Alaska antennas only affect the ionosphere, which is much higher and where there are no clouds or rain. They also point out that HAARP waves cannot travel across the planet to cause earthquakes on the other side of the world. Today, the project seeks to shake off its reputation as a secret laboratory, opening its doors to the public. Since the University of Alaska, Fairbanks took full control in 2015. Open house days are held every year where anyone can walk among the antennas and learn about the equipment. Even so, for many people, this site will continue to be that strange laboratory in Alaska where someone could be pressing a button to change the world's fate. 6. The NPC Theory. Before, we saw that the dead internet theory poses the possibility that much of what we see online does not come from real people but from bots. However, there is another idea that takes this same anxiety several steps further as it leaves the internet and enters the real world. We are talking about the possibility that some of the people we interact with every day are not really present, at least not in the way we assume. Some interactions often leave a strange sensation that goes beyond someone being distracted or tired, feeling as if the conversation had occurred automatically, with prefabricated responses that don't quite feel connected to what was being said. This is what is known as the NPC theory. This term comes from video games, where NPC means non-playable character. These are characters that are part of the environment, for example, a shopkeeper or a person walking down the street. They are basically figures that seem to have a life of their own within the game. But in reality, they only follow predefined and basic instructions because they don't make decisions, don't improvise, and don't have their own consciousness. No one controls them. They simply react within a limited range of responses designed to maintain the coherence of the virtual world they inhabit. Well, the theory transfers this to the real world, posing the possibility that there are people in this world who function in a similar way. This idea began circulating around 2016 inches, some forums like 4chan, where users proposed hypotheses that, although they sound extreme, manage to resonate with many people. According to this idea, the number of consciousnesses in the world could be limited, and population growth would have caused a portion of individuals to not have an internal life of their own, acting solely under patterns and following predefined behaviors that allow them to fit into the environment. Yes, we know it sounds strange, and it is actually quite likely that this initial post started as a joke or a kind of trolling. However, the concept was popularized mainly through various memes, where the protagonist was the character known as Wojak, showing an expressionless face that represented this type of person. By 2018, the term was being used massively on social networks, even leading to the deletion of thousands of accounts that used this image in a coordinated way, which ended up amplifying its presence even more. But beyond the meme, what keeps this theory alive is the sensation, real or not, that gave rise to it, as many claim to have had conversations in which the other person repeated questions without noticing they had already been answered, or responded with phrases unrelated to what had just been said, or simply looked disconnected, as if there were a small delay between what happens and their reaction. It is not a constant thing and not a rule, but very specific moments that generate the impression that something is not working as it should. It is there that the comparison with video games becomes inevitable. As in that environment, NPCs exist to fulfill a specific function, but aren't designed to question anything or deviate from their programming. Under this logic, the theory suggests that not everyone would be playing the same role, and that some could simply be part of the environment necessary elements for the system to function in a stable manner. And here it is also important to clarify that calling someone an NPC became a kind of insult on the internet, especially in political spheres, but this completely departs from the idea that there are people walking around the world living without a consciousness. We clarify this so you know there are two versions of this theory, the one that is a meme and the one that goes more toward questioning reality. Now, in its most extreme versions, this idea connects directly with something we talked about earlier, the possibility that reality is more like a simulation. If that were the case, not all elements of the system would have to have the same level of complexity. Some could be completely conscious entities, while others would exist solely to maintain the world's structure, following routines, repetitive behaviors, and limited responses. However, it must also be clarified that there are explanations much closer to reality that help explain why this perception exists. For example, for years, the idea has been discussed that not everyone experiences thought in the same way. There are those who claim they do not have a constant internal monologue, no voice, with which many people organize ideas or reflect. Added to this are much more common factors like anxiety, depression, fatigue, or information overload, which can affect the way a person responds and interacts. Furthermore, states like the so-called languishing, a kind of emotional apathy that doesn't reach the level of an illness but reduces energy and responsiveness, could make someone appear disconnected, slow, or unresponsive, giving the impression that they are functioning automatically. There is also a psychological aspect that explains why this theory is so attractive: the tendency to see oneself as the center of the experience, or what some call main character syndrome, can distort the way others are perceived. That is why, when someone doesn't act as we expect, it is easier to assume there is no depth behind them than to accept that their way of processing the world is different or simply not accessible at that moment. So, reducing others to the idea that they are NPCs implies simplifying something that is actually much more complex. Even so, this theory remains circulating, not because there is much evidence to support it, but because it is something with which many people have identified a feeling that in one way or another, we are more alone than it seems. 7. The targeted individuals. In the movie The Truman Show, we saw the story of a man whose reality was, without him knowing, a television show where he was the protagonist and absolutely everyone around him was nothing more than a setup, with everyone conspiring to keep him in that false reality. Think of something like that, but where the victim is aware at all times and finds it impossible to escape. You might be surprised, but there are thousands of people in the world who believe they are victims of gang stalking or organized harassment. These people call themselves targeted individuals and claim to be victims of a massive plot that combines extreme surveillance with secret technological attacks. According to their accounts, government agents, criminal groups, or even their own neighbors are conspiring day after day to harass them and remind them that they are always being watched. This community, which is estimated to exceed 10,000 people in the world, describes living distressing experiences daily. The most common symptom is what they call voice to skull, V2K, a supposed technology that allows sounds, insults, or thoughts to be transmitted directly inside their heads, without anyone else being able to hear them. In addition to the voices, many report physical sensations like burning on the skin, electric shocks, or internal vibrations that they attribute to the use of directed energy weapons and microwaves. For the affected, these aggressions are not the product of their imagination, but real attacks that use the nervous system as a weapon against them. To support their claims, targeted individuals research declassified military documents and news about scientific advances. They cite historical programs like DARPA's Project Pandora, which studied the effects of microwaves, or patents that describe how to send words to the brain via radio waves. Some even see in the arrival of new communication networks like 5G, a potential infrastructure to read or insert thoughts into the population. For these people, the existence of this research is the definitive proof that the technology needed to control us is already operational, even if in secret. Over time, online communities have formed, such as forums and support groups, where targeted individuals share their theories and experiences. Although the vast majority of them are not violent, there are tragic cases where these beliefs have ended in serious crimes. Some affected individuals, pushed by the desperation of feeling tortured, have committed mass crimes, taking the lives of many people. A notable example occurred in 2013 when a man named Aaron Alexis killed 12 people, convinced that low-frequency electromagnetic waves were controlling his mind. Other cases include Myron May, a lawyer who left his successful career after feeling watched. In November 2014, this feeling of persecution led him to enter the library of his former university, where he shot and injured 3 people before dying in a confrontation with the police. The lawyer left letters explaining that he didn't want to die in vain and documents titled, "My Experiences as a Targeted Individual," where he described his frustration because the authorities refused to investigate the harassment he claimed to suffer. There is also the story of Fouad Abdo Ahmed, who in August 2013 took 3 people hostage in a Louisiana bank. Ahmed, who was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, demanded urgently that the authorities remove a supposed microphone or listening device that, according to his delusions, his ex-girlfriend's family had surgically implanted in his head. The incident ended violently when Ahmed killed 2 of the hostages and then took his own life. An unsettling detail is that there is recent military research that explores methods which, although designed for medical purposes, raise the theoretical possibility of influencing the brain from a distance. Programs from agencies like DARPA, known as N3, seek to create systems to read and write brain signals without the need for surgery. The use of neural dust or small injectable particles would theoretically allow the control of muscles or sensations using magnetic fields or ultrasound. Even if the official objective of these projects is to help soldiers control machines or treat diseases, there is concern that these same tools could be used to manipulate people's nervous systems in a hostile way. This phenomenon has a global reach and has been reported in countries like Russia, France, Belgium, and India. In Russia, for example, there have been groups since the 90s demanding damages for experiments that supposedly alter the mind with chemicals or magnets. For experts, these would simply be individuals with mental problems who have found in the internet a refuge to amplify their own beliefs and delusions. But think for just 1 second how tremendously terrifying it would be if one day it was proven that these people were telling the truth all along. 8. The Great Filter. For decades, a question has haunted the brightest minds on the planet, from scientists to astronomers and physicists. A doubt that seems simple, but the more it is analyzed, the more complex and uncomfortable it becomes. Where is everyone in the universe? Only in our galaxy are there hundreds of billions of stars, many of which have planets orbiting them. So even if life were extremely rare, logic would dictate that we are not alone, that we are not the only ones, and that somewhere, other civilizations have emerged, evolved, and reached advanced technological levels. But there is nothing, no clear signals, no artificial structures in sight, or traces of civilizations that have colonized their environment. The universe, at least from our perspective, is silent. This contradiction is known as the Fermi paradox, and one of the most unsettling explanations proposed to solve it is the so-called Great Filter. The idea is relatively simple, but its implications are not. For the Great Filter proposes that on the path from inert matter to a civilization capable of traveling between the stars, there is at least one extremely difficult obstacle to overcome, a point in the evolutionary or technological process where the vast majority of life forms simply fail to advance, or in other words, something stops them. To understand it better, some researchers have divided this process into multiple stages. From the formation of a habitable planet, the emergence of life, the appearance of complex cells, multicellular organisms, intelligence, technological development, and finally, the capacity to expand beyond their own planet. Each of these steps implies a series of very specific conditions, so the theory suggests that at least one of them is so improbable that almost no civilization manages to complete it. The big question is, where is the filter? Because one possibility is that it is in the past that one of the steps we have already overcome was so improbable that, in practice, we are an anomaly, an extremely rare accident within a universe where complex life almost never manages to emerge. In fact, some scientists have pointed out that certain events in Earth's history could have been so improbable that they would hardly happen again, such as the transition from simple organisms to complex cells, a process that required multiple conditions occurring at the same time, and which, as far as we know, only happened once in billions of years. If that is the case, then the absence of other civilizations would not be something worrying, but the opposite. It would mean that we have already passed the hardest part, that in some way we managed to cross that almost impossible point, and that what follows, although uncertain, is not as improbable as what has already occurred. But there is another possibility, a much more unsettling one, that the Great Filter is not behind us, but ahead of us, that the reason we don't see advanced civilizations is not because they have never existed, but because none managed to survive long enough to reach that point, because something stops them in their tracks, and that something can take many forms, from completely external events like the impact of an asteroid or a nearby stellar explosion, capable of ending all life on a planet regardless of its level of development, to something much closer, like our own technological advancement. Because for a civilization to be capable of traveling through space, it needs to master enormous amounts of energy, and that same capacity can become a threat. Weapons of mass destruction, artificial intelligence out of control, ecological collapses, or internal conflicts can be enough to end a species before it has the opportunity to expand beyond its planet. There is even a more uncomfortable implication, that finding life in other places in the universe might not be good news, because if we discover that life is common, that it emerges easily, then that would imply that the filter is not in the first steps, but in the last ones, which would place the obstacle directly in our future again. Throughout time, This idea has been interpreted in different ways. Some consider that the problem is not only biological or technological, but also psychological, as the instinct for survival, resistance to change, or fear of risks could lead an entire civilization to stop its own development, thus avoiding taking steps that, although necessary to advance, also imply a real risk, a real danger of disappearing. It has even been proposed that the silence of the universe does not necessarily mean absence, but caution that other civilizations may be out there. But they choose not to make themselves visible, thus avoiding attracting attention or potential threats. But far from all these interpretations, one idea remains constant, that something is failing in the process, which prevents life from becoming something bigger. The problem is that the only reference we have is our own existence, which is not enough to have a definitive conclusion, but it is unsettling enough to make us rethink everything we believe we are, and our place in the cosmos. 9. The Boltzmann Brain. We already told you at the beginning of this episode about the brain in a vat theory, but what I am going to tell you next goes one step further. A Boltzmann brain is a fascinating idea about an entity that has self-knowledge and appears out of nowhere due to pure chance in the middle of chaos. This proposal owes its name to Ludwig Boltzmann, a scientist who tried to explain why our world looks so organized. To understand it, we must think of a rule of nature called the second law of thermodynamics, which says that things always tend toward disorder. It is like having a bag with red and green marbles perfectly separated. If we shake the bag, the marbles will mix, and it will be almost impossible for them to reorder themselves into perfect layers on their own. Following this same logic, it would be most normal for the universe to be an empty and completely disordered space. However, when we look at the sky, we see stars, planets, and people, which represents an impressive order. Boltzmann suggested that perhaps everything we see is simply a random fluctuation, that is, a moment of luck, where disorder became order for just an instant in a universe that lasts forever. Science tells us that if time is infinite, anything, no matter how difficult, will end up happening sooner or later. Here is where the great paradox or mystery appears. Creating an entire universe with billions of galaxies and people is something extremely difficult for chance. But mathematically speaking, it is much simpler and more probable for chance to gather a few pieces to form a single lonely brain floating in the void. This brain would appear for just a second and would have false memories of a complete life, of friends and family who never actually existed. According to this theory, it is easier for nature to manufacture a brain that believes it is listening to this voice narrating this theory right now than it is to manufacture an entire planet Earth and a solar system. One of the strongest arguments against this proposal has to do with the mathematics of infinite time. If the universe lasts forever, something curious happens with numbers. Although it is much easier to create a Boltzmann brain than a real human, in eternity there would be an infinite amount of both. This means that mathematically, there is no definitive reason to say that it is more probable to be an illusion than a real person. Perhaps the most surprising thing about this paradox is that it becomes more dangerous if time were not infinite, but simply very long. If time had an end, then Boltzmann brains could indeed outnumber real humans before everything shuts down. So, although it is very unlikely that you or I are brains floating in space, the idea never ceases to be fascinating. We hope you liked these theories and that they also unsettled you. Even if just a little, we remind you that we will see you this May 5th at the 139, and you can find your tickets. You can buy your tickets in the description. Without more to say, I say goodbye. I am Nightcrawler, and I am Masked Man. See you later.